The morning light filtered through the towering trees lining the wide streets of Crestwood, casting long, elegant shadows on the manicured lawns. Olivia Carter, a newly promoted lieutenant, gripped the steering wheel of her unmarked police car, her gaze steady as the precinct building came into view. Crestwood was one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, a place where the streets were clean, the homes sprawling, and the faces, for the most part, pale. It was a world she had seldom entered, and today, she was about to step into its center. The precinct itself was a modern marvel of glass and steel, standing tall and proud amidst its surroundings. Olivia felt a quiet mix of anticipation and unease. She had worked hard to earn her place here, climbing a ladder that seemed designed to shake with every step she took. Yet, this promotion, a testament to her skill and perseverance, carried a weight she couldn't ignore. As her car rolled into the precinct parking lot, she noticed clusters of officers lingering near their vehicles, their conversations dissolving into silence as her car came to a stop. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, questioning. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this scrutiny, but it always carried the same chill. Steeling herself, she stepped out of the car, her uniform crisp and her head held high. Olivia had long since mastered the art of composure. She ignored the murmurs as she walked toward the entrance, her boots clicking softly against the pavement. Confidence wasn't an act. It was her armor, carefully constructed over years of confronting the unspoken but undeniable barriers placed in her path. As she approached the glass doors, she caught snippets of conversation from the officers still gathered in the lot. "Didn't know we were getting a new lieutenant," one said, his tone sharp with curiosity. "Yeah, and not her," another muttered, his voice barely audible but carrying enough edge to leave an impression. Olivia's jaw tightened, but her expression didn't waver. She had learned early in her career that words, especially whispered ones, were only as powerful as the weight she gave them. Instead, she focused on the task ahead. Inside, the precinct was everything she'd expected: sleek, efficient, and sterile. Officers moved briskly between desks, their chatter blending with the hum of computers and ringing phones. The air smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. It could have been any precinct, save for the subtle tension that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. At the reception desk, a young officer glanced up as Olivia approached. His eyes flicked to the insignia on her uniform, his surprise poorly masked. "Lieutenant Olivia Carter," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the noise without effort. "I'm here to see Captain Grant." The officer hesitated for a beat before nodding. "Yes, ma'am, I'll let him know." As she waited, Olivia glanced around the room. Conversation seemed to quiet when her presence was noticed, only to resume again in hushed tones. It wasn't new to her, but it was no less disheartening. She had spent years proving herself in other precincts, earning the respect of her peers. But here, it seemed she was starting over. "Lieutenant Carter," a voice called, breaking her thoughts. She turned to see Captain Michael Grant striding toward her. He was tall, his salt and pepper hair lending him an air of authority. His expression was professional but distant, as if he was still reserving judgment. "Welcome to Crestwood," he said, extending a hand. "I trust your drive was uneventful?" "It was, thank you," Olivia replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Good." He gestured for her to follow him. "Let's get you settled." As they moved through the precinct, Olivia was acutely aware of the way the other officers watched her. Their glances were quick but deliberate, each one carrying a quiet question. Who is she? And what is she doing here? In Grant's office, the air was quieter but no less tense. He closed the door and motioned for her to sit. "I'll be straightforward, Lieutenant," he began, settling into his chair. "This precinct, it operates a little differently. Crestwood is a tight-knit community, and that extends to the officers here. They've been working together for years, and they're protective of the status quo." Olivia met his gaze, her expression steady. "I understand, Captain. I'm not here to disrupt the good work being done. I'm here to contribute." Grant nodded slowly but didn't seem entirely convinced. "Your record speaks for itself. You have a reputation for being thorough and, let's say, unafraid of ruffling feathers. That's commendable, but it can also make transitions like this challenging. Olivia's lips tightened slightly. She had heard variations of this speech before. It was a polite way of saying, "You're not what they expected. And they're not sure they want you here. I've dealt with challenges before, Captain," she said calmly, "and I've always found a way to work through them." Grant studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. I hope that holds true here." The meeting concluded with a review of her responsibilities and a promise of support, though Olivia noted it was tempered with caution. As she left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been handed a puzzle with missing pieces. The path forward would not be straightforward, but she hadn't expected it to be. Walking back through the precinct, Olivia's presence continued to draw attention. She met each gaze with quiet confidence, determined to establish herself as a leader, not just an outsider. As she approached the locker room to grab her equipment, she noticed one officer standing off to the side, watching her more intently than the others. His name tag read, Pierce, and his expression was a mix of curiosity and something colder. Olivia offered a polite nod as she passed, but Pierce didn't return it. Instead, he turned to another officer and muttered something under his breath, sparking a quiet chuckle. Olivia didn't react outwardly, but the moment stayed with her. It was a reminder of the uphill climb she faced. The day ended with Olivia returning to her car in the fading light. The parking lot was mostly empty now, the quiet a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the precinct. As she sat behind the wheel, she took a moment to reflect. This was a beginning, but it was also a battle. The fight for respect, for trust, and for change was one she had fought before. She would fight it again. And she would win. The morning sun rose over Crestwood with an almost disarming serenity. The soft golden light filtered through the polished glass windows of the precinct, reflecting a calm at odds with the tension Olivia Carter had felt the day before. The day-to-day rhythm of police work had resumed, but beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingered. Olivia sat at her desk, a small, tidy space tucked into the corner of the squad room. The desk bore no personal touches yet. No photos, no trinkets, nothing to suggest it belonged to her. She hadn't had the time or, perhaps, the inclination. It felt too early to plant roots in a place that still regarded her with suspicion. The murmur of voices around her was low but constant. Officers moved in and out, some nodding briskly in her direction, others pretending not to notice her at all. Olivia kept her focus on the reports in front of her, but she was keenly aware of the dynamics unfolding in the room. Every precinct had its own rhythm, its own culture, and she was learning Crestwood's with each passing moment. Sergeant Tom Davis, a grizzled veteran who had been tasked with showing her the ropes, approached her desk. His demeanor was neutral, professional, but there was a faint wariness in his eyes, as if he too was assessing her, trying to determine where she fit in this carefully balanced ecosystem. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, handing her a file. "Here's the briefing on the Crestwood burglary cases. I thought you might want to familiarize yourself before the morning meeting." "Thank you, Sergeant," Olivia replied, taking the file. Her tone was polite, her expression calm, though she noted the slight hesitation before he turned to leave. As she opened the file, a shadow fell across her desk. Looking up, she saw Officer Pierce standing there, his arms crossed, his posture casual but pointed. The same cold curiosity she had noticed the day before lingered in his eyes. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said, his tone just shy of polite. "Settling in all right?" Olivia met his gaze evenly. "So far, so good, thank you, Officer Pierce." He leaned slightly against the desk beside hers, as though testing boundaries. "You know, Crestwood's a unique precinct. Things run a little differently here. Might take some getting used to." Olivia set the file down, folding her hands on the desk. "I imagine every precinct has its own quirks. I'm here to learn and contribute." Pierce's lips curved into a faint smirk. "Well, I'm sure you'll do fine. Just, don't shake things up too much. People here like things the way they are." The words hung in the air like a thin veil of smoke, their meaning clear even if unspoken. Olivia's gaze didn't waver. "Change can be uncomfortable," she said simply, "but sometimes it's necessary." Pierce straightened, the smirk fading slightly, and with a curt nod, he walked away. Olivia watched him go, her expression unreadable, but inside, she felt the quiet thrum of resolve. Encounters like this were not new to her, and she knew they would not be the last. The morning meeting was held in the briefing room, a space dominated by a long table and a wall-mounted screen displaying crime stats. Captain Grant stood at the head of the table, addressing the room with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to command. Olivia sat to his right, her presence as the new lieutenant a quiet but undeniable reminder that the precinct was entering a new phase. "We've had 3 residential burglaries in the past 2 weeks," Grant said, gesturing to the screen, "all in the Western District. All following a similar pattern. The suspects appear to be targeting high-value homes, entering through second-story windows." The officers around the table listened attentively, some jotting down notes, others nodding. Olivia observed them carefully, noting the unspoken hierarchy in their interactions. The subtle glances exchanged, the moments of deference. It was clear who held sway in the room, and equally clear who didn't. When Grant finished outlining the details, he turned to Olivia. "Lieutenant Carter, any thoughts?" It was a test. Olivia realized a chance for her to assert herself or falter. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but confident. "The pattern suggests familiarity with the area. This could indicate a local connection, someone who knows which homes are vulnerable and when. I'd recommend focusing our patrols on the Western District during evenings and weekends, and cross-referencing the locations with recent service calls or contractors in the area." There was a brief pause. A few officers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Captain Grant nodded. "Good suggestion. Let's implement it." As the meeting adjourned, Olivia noticed Pierce lingering by the door, his expression inscrutable. She didn't acknowledge him as she left the room, but she could feel his gaze following her. The afternoon brought a small but significant incident. Olivia was reviewing files in her office when a knock at the door interrupted her. It was Officer Martinez, a young recruit with a nervous energy that contrasted sharply with Pierce's quiet hostility. "Lieutenant," Martinez began, shifting slightly under her steady gaze, "I just wanted to say, welcome to the precinct." "Thank you, officer," Olivia said, her tone warm but measured. "Is there something on your mind?" Martinez hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, actually, I heard some guys talking earlier. About you. They weren't exactly being respectful." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "I see. And why are you telling me this?" "I just thought you should know," Martinez said, his voice low. "Not everyone here is on board with you being here. But not all of us feel that way." Olivia regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate your honesty, Officer Martinez. Thank you." As he left, Olivia leaned back in her chair, her mind turning over his words. It was a small gesture, but it hinted at cracks in the wall of resistance she faced. Cracks she intended to widen. By the end of the day, Olivia found herself back in the parking lot, the setting sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The precinct had quieted, but the echoes of the day lingered. She stood by her car for a moment, taking in the stillness. Before opening the door, a movement caught her eye. Turning, she saw Pierce standing near the edge of the lot, his figure outlined against the dimming light. He wasn't looking at her this time. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his posture contemplative. For a brief moment, Olivia wondered what thoughts lingered behind his guarded exterior. Was it fear? Anger? Something deeper? The moment passed, and she climbed into her car. As she drove away, the tension of the day eased, replaced by a quiet determination. The road ahead would not be easy, but Olivia Carter had never expected it to be. She had chosen this path knowing the weight it carried, and she would walk it, step by step, until the weight became lighter. Above all, she reminded herself, change didn't happen all at once. It was a steady, deliberate process, like water carving through stone. And Olivia was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. The precinct was quieter than usual, but the quiet felt heavy rather than peaceful. Olivia Carter noticed the way sound carried in the long, polished halls. Her footsteps on the tile, the occasional murmured conversation behind closed doors, the rustle of papers from unseen desks. She was becoming accustomed to Crestwood's atmosphere, But familiarity didn't bring comfort. Not yet. She spent the morning in her office, going over incident reports and making notes for the weekly strategy session. The burglary cases were progressing slowly, but there were other, smaller issues that demanded her attention. Misfiled reports, unclear communication, and a general sense of disorganization. Small cracks in the foundation that hinted at larger structural issues. Olivia had seen it before in other precincts. The effects of complacency, amplified by the unspoken hierarchies that ruled the workplace. A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. She looked up to see Sergeant Tom Davis standing there, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. His expression was neutral, as always, but there was a faint furrow in his brow. "Lieutenant," he said, stepping inside. "Got a minute?" Olivia nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Sergeant?" Davis placed the folder on her desk but didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with a quiet intensity. "You've been here a week now. How are you finding things?" It was a loaded question. Olivia knew, but she answered honestly. "The work itself is straightforward enough. The team," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "The team is still adjusting." "I expected that." Davis nodded slowly. "They'll come around. Most of them. Anyway, change takes time." "I'm aware," Olivia replied, her tone even. "But time alone doesn't fix problems. It just makes them easier to ignore." For a moment, Davis said nothing. Then he opened the folder, revealing a series of complaint forms. These came through HR last month. Minor incidents, unprofessional conduct, a few reports of excessive force. Nothing that set off alarm bells, but enough to raise an eyebrow. Olivia scanned the pages, her jaw tightening. The names on the forms weren't unfamiliar: Pierce, O'Connor, and a few others who had made their skepticism of her clear. The incidents were small, isolated, but they painted a troubling picture when viewed together. "These were handled in-house?" she asked. Davis nodded. "Swept under the rug, more or less. It's the way things have been done here for a while." Olivia closed the folder, her expression unreadable. "Not anymore." Davis studied her for a moment, then leaned forward. "You're going to ruffle some feathers, Lieutenant. You know that, right?" "I didn't take this job to keep things smooth, Sergeant," Olivia said quietly. "I took it to make a difference." That afternoon, Olivia joined a patrol ride along with Officer Martinez. It was part of her effort to get to know the team and the community better. Martinez was young, eager, and nervous in her presence, but he had a sincerity that Olivia found refreshing. As they cruised through Crestwood's Western District, the sun filtered through the canopy of well-maintained trees lining the streets. The neighborhood's affluence was evident in every detail. The pristine sidewalks, the expensive cars parked in driveways, the lack of litter or graffiti. Yet beneath the surface, Olivia sensed an unease. People on the sidewalks glanced at the patrol car with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The kind of quiet tension that spoke volumes about unspoken boundaries. "You grew up around here?" Olivia asked, breaking the silence. Martinez shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm from the South Side. Whole different world over there." Olivia nodded, understanding. "And what brought you to Crestwood?" He hesitated, glancing at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Honestly, I thought it'd be easier. Less dangerous than working in the rougher neighborhoods. But it's not what I expected." "How so?" Martinez hesitated again, then sighed. "It's not the people out there," he said, gesturing toward the houses. "It's the people here." He tapped the steering wheel lightly. "The way some of the guys talk. The way they treat folks. It doesn't sit right with me." Olivia regarded him thoughtfully. "Why stay?" Martinez glanced at her again, this time with a flicker of determination in his eyes. "Because it's got to change. And nothing changes if everyone who cares leaves." For a moment, Olivia said nothing. Then she nodded. "You're right, Martinez. It doesn't." Back at the precinct, Olivia stopped by the locker room to retrieve her things. She was alone at first, but as she zipped her bag, she heard voices approaching. She recognized them immediately: Pierce and O'Connor. "Just saying, she's already throwing her weight around," O'Connor was saying. "Doesn't even know us." But she thinks she can come in and tell us how to do our jobs. Pierce's reply was quieter, but Olivia caught the sharp edge in his tone. She's here to make a name for herself. Doesn't care who she steps on to do it. Olivia didn't move, didn't make a sound. She could have walked out, confronted them, but she stayed still, letting their words settle in the air. She'll slip up eventually, O'Connor added. They always do. Pierce chuckled, a low, bitter sound. Yeah, and when she does, we'll be ready. The door swung open, and they froze, their laughter cutting off abruptly as they saw her standing there. For a long moment, no one spoke. Olivia met their eyes one by one, her expression calm but unyielding. Gentlemen, she said finally, her tone as even as ever. Enjoy your evening. She walked past them without another word, her back straight, her steps measured. Inside, she felt a flicker of anger, but she didn't let it show. Their words weren't surprising, nor were they new. She had faced worse, but they were a reminder of the work still ahead, and of the quiet battles that would define her time here. As she left the precinct, the evening air was cool and quiet. Olivia paused for a moment, looking up at the darkening sky. Change was never easy, she reminded herself. It came slowly, quietly, and often met with resistance. But it came, nonetheless. She took a deep breath, then got into her car and drove away. The precinct buzzed with its usual rhythms, telephones ringing, keys clicking against keyboards, conversations rising and falling. But beneath the surface, Olivia could feel the tension weaving through the air like an invisible thread. It wasn't the sort of tension born of an impending crisis or high-stakes investigation. This was quieter, more insidious. It lived in glances exchanged too quickly, in clipped tones during routine interactions, in the way certain officers suddenly seemed too busy to acknowledge her presence. It wasn't unexpected. Change, especially the kind that challenged unspoken norms, was never easy, but Olivia had hoped for more professionalism, more courage, more willingness to confront the flaws that were now impossible to ignore. She spent her morning reviewing case updates, her office door open as a quiet invitation to the team. Few took her up on it. Most who passed by avoided eye contact. Others stopped briefly, offering perfunctory updates before retreating. It was as though her authority cast a shadow too sharp for them to stand under for long. Around noon, she received a summons to Captain Mitchell's office. The tone of the email was formal, almost curt. Discussion regarding recent developments. Immediate attention required. When she arrived, she found Mitchell seated at his desk, his expression unreadable. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched beside a stack of papers. Olivia nodded in greeting as she closed the door behind her. "Captain," she said, taking a seat across from him. Mitchell leaned back, folding his hands across his chest. "Lieutenant Carter," he began, his tone measured, "I've been receiving feedback, some formal, some less so, about your recent actions." Olivia raised an eyebrow, but her voice remained neutral. "Feedback?" Mitchell nodded. "It seems that some members of the team feel unsettled by the direction things are taking. They've expressed concerns that you're moving too quickly, disrupting established dynamics." For a moment, Olivia considered her response. She could feel the weight of the words that had gone unspoken. The subtle pushback from officers unwilling to adapt. The discomfort of those who saw her presence as a challenge to their authority. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered resistance. And it wouldn't be the last. "With all due respect, Captain," she said finally, "change is rarely comfortable, but discomfort doesn't mean we're on the wrong path." Mitchell studied her for a long moment before sighing. "I don't disagree, Carter, but we have to tread carefully. This isn't just about what's right, it's about maintaining cohesion within the team. If we lose that, we lose everything." Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I understand the need for balance, Captain, but I also believe that avoiding tension for the sake of comfort only delays the inevitable. These issues have been simmering for years. Ignoring them won't make them disappear." Mitchell leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "What's your endgame here, Carter? What do you hope to accomplish?" Olivia met his gaze, her voice steady. "Accountability, trust. A precinct where every officer, regardless of their background, feels valued." and where the community sees us as protectors, not threats. Mitchell didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip before setting the cup down. That's a lofty goal, he said at last, but it's not impossible. Just be mindful of the pace. We need to bring them along, not alienate them. Later that afternoon, Olivia joined a community outreach meeting organized by Sergeant Davis. The room was small but filled with representatives from local businesses, schools, and neighborhood groups. Their faces reflected a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and cautious hope. Davis began the meeting with an overview of recent initiatives, focusing on efforts to improve transparency and build stronger relationships with the community. When he finished, he introduced Olivia, who stood and offered a measured smile. "Good afternoon," she began, her tone calm but resolute. "I'm Lieutenant Olivia Carter. I've been with the Crestwood precinct for a little over a week now. And while I'm still learning the unique dynamics of this community, I want you to know that I'm here to listen and to act." She paused, scanning the room. "I know trust isn't something that's given lightly. It has to be earned, especially when that trust has been broken in the past. I can't promise to fix everything overnight, but I can promise you this: I'm committed to addressing the challenges we face, together." A man in the back of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, raised a hand. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, we've heard promises before. What makes this any different?" Olivia met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "That's a fair question. I can't undo what's been done, and I won't make empty promises. But I can tell you that my focus is on accountability, within our ranks and in how we serve you. Change takes time, but it also takes persistence. I'm here for the long haul." The man nodded slowly, his posture softening just a fraction. Others in the room exchanged glances, their expressions cautiously optimistic. Olivia could feel the shift, small, almost imperceptible, but real. As the day wound to a close, Olivia found herself in the squad room, reviewing notes from the meeting. The precinct was quieter now, with most officers either on patrol or finishing up paperwork. She was just about to leave when Officer Martinez appeared in the doorway. "Lieutenant," he said hesitantly. She looked up, setting her pen aside. "What is it, Martinez?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I just wanted to say, I thought you handled the meeting well. The community's been waiting for someone to take them seriously." Olivia smiled faintly. "Thank you, Martinez. That means a lot." He hesitated, then added, "Not everyone's going to see it that way, though. Some of the guys are already grumbling about the changes, saying it's making their jobs harder." "I'm aware," Olivia said evenly, "but doing the right thing isn't always easy. And it's not about making their jobs harder, it's about making them better." Martinez nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that, and I think more people will, too, eventually. Just give it time." As he left, Olivia sat back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, their glow faint but steady. Change was coming, slow and uncertain, but it was coming, and Olivia would be there, steady as those lights, guiding the way forward. The precinct was awake early, but not with the usual rhythm of police work. The fallout from recent events had left a mark, and the atmosphere carried the weight of uncertainty. Whispers trailed through the halls like the wind through dry leaves, quiet but impossible to ignore. Olivia moved through it all with the steady composure of someone who had seen storms before. She knew the winds might tear through the place, but she wasn't about to let them topple her. Her day began in Captain Mitchell's office, where a small group of senior officers had gathered to discuss the next steps in addressing the growing rift within the precinct. Mitchell's face was lined with exhaustion, the kind born from trying to hold together a team that seemed intent on fracturing. "We've got two factions forming," he said, leaning on his desk as he spoke. "Those who see the need for change, and those who are digging in their heels. It's no longer just quiet resistance, it's active opposition." Sergeant Davis nodded. "It's not just Carter's loyalists. Some of the younger officers are confused. They're hearing a lot of noise about tradition and trust, and they're not sure where to stand." Olivia listened, her expression calm but thoughtful. She had spent years navigating dynamics like these, though never on this scale. What we're seeing isn't new, she said finally. Resistance to change always shows up when people feel their comfort is threatened. But comfort isn't what we're here to preserve. Mitchell sighed. Comfort may not be the goal, but it's the glue that keeps this place functional. If it comes apart, we've got bigger problems than bias training to deal with. Olivia looked him in the eye. Maybe letting it come apart is the only way to rebuild it into something better. Later that morning, Olivia found herself in the locker room, her hands methodically organizing her gear as two officers walked in. They didn't acknowledge her, though their conversation was hard to miss. I'm telling you, one said, his voice tinged with frustration. This whole thing is blowing up for no reason. Carter wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve to be thrown under the bus like that. The other officer, younger and more hesitant, replied, but he pulled a gun on her. Doesn't that cross a line? The first officer scoffed. You don't get it. People like her. He stopped short, glancing briefly in Olivia's direction. Then lowering his voice. They come in here acting like they're going to fix everything. But they don't understand how things work. We've got enough problems without adding politics to the mix. Olivia didn't flinch, didn't turn to confront them. She had learned long ago that battles fought in anger rarely led to victory. Instead, she finished what she was doing and left without a word. Their whispers followed her into the hallway, faint but lingering. That afternoon, Olivia called a meeting in the squad room. It wasn't the kind of meeting with a clear agenda or a polished presentation. This was about something deeper, something harder to name but impossible to ignore. The room filled slowly, officers taking their seats with a mix of curiosity and caution. Olivia stood at the front, her posture relaxed but her presence commanding. She let the silence settle for a moment before speaking. I want to talk about trust. She began, her voice even, not the kind we talk about in policy meetings or training sessions. I'm talking about the trust we're supposed to have in each other. The kind of trust that lets us do our jobs and protect this community. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who would meet hers. Some looked away quickly, others held her gaze with quiet defiance. I know there's tension right now, she continued. I know some of you feel like everything's changing too fast. Like the ground you've been standing on isn't solid anymore. But here's the thing. Maybe that ground was never as solid as we thought. A murmur rippled through the room. She let it fade before continuing. We wear these badges because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. At least, that's why I wear mine. But believing in something bigger means holding ourselves to higher standards. It means looking at the cracks in the foundation and deciding to fix them. Even if it means tearing up the floorboards. Officer Martinez raised a hand. His voice cautious. Lieutenant, I get what you're saying. But some of us feel like we're being blamed for things we didn't do. How do we move forward if everyone's on edge? Olivia nodded. That's a fair question. Moving forward doesn't mean pointing fingers. It means looking in the mirror. It means asking ourselves if we're doing everything we can to make this precinct better. It means having the courage to admit when we've fallen short. Another voice cut in, sharper this time. And what about when the community doesn't trust us? We're out there every day, taking the heat for things we didn't do. How do we fix that? Olivia turned to face the speaker, a senior officer with a weary expression. We fix it by being better. By showing them. Not telling them that we're here to serve. Not just enforce. Trust isn't given, it's earned. And right now, we've got work to do. After the meeting, Olivia stayed behind to answer questions and hear concerns. Some officers approached her with guarded optimism, others with thinly veiled skepticism. By the time the room emptied, she felt both encouraged and drained. Progress was there, but it was slow, uneven, and fragile. She returned to her office, where Sergeant Davis was waiting. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. That was bold, he said. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Bold, or reckless? Maybe a little of both, he admitted, but it needed to be said. Not everyone's going to like it. Though, I'm not here to be liked, she replied. I'm here to lead. Davis nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Fair enough. Just don't forget, you're not alone in this. As the day wound down, Olivia found herself in the parking lot, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. She leaned against her car, her thoughts a quiet storm of reflection and resolve. This was the hard part. The part where the cracks became visible, where the fault lines deepened before they could be healed. But Olivia knew that every fracture held the potential for something stronger, something more resilient, and she was willing to endure the breaking, as long as it led to the rebuilding. The precinct felt different, not calmer, not at peace, but quieter in the way a battlefield grows silent before the next clash. Olivia had spent the better part of the week meeting with officers, mediating tensions, and navigating the fallout from recent events. Progress was slow, like walking upstream, and she could feel the weight of the resistance pressing against her at every step. On a cloudy morning, Olivia sat in Captain Mitchell's office, reviewing the latest updates from the Independent Oversight Committee. The findings were as thorough as they were unsettling: patterns of misconduct ignored, complaints swept under the rug, and a culture of silence that had allowed biases to fester unchecked. Mitchell rubbed his temples as Olivia skimmed the report. "This isn't just a wake-up call," he muttered. "It's a fire alarm." Olivia nodded, her expression neutral but her mind churning. The question is, who's ready to respond and who's going to pretend they don't hear it? Mitchell leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "That's what worries me. I've got good officers here, but some of them are clinging to the old ways like they're life preservers. They don't see that those ways are what's sinking the ship." Olivia closed the file, her gaze steady. "Then we make them see it. We don't let them ignore the cracks in the hull." That afternoon, Olivia called another all-hands meeting. The squad room was packed, the tension palpable as officers filed in, their faces a mix of apprehension and defiance. Olivia stood at the front, her stance relaxed but purposeful. "I know you're tired," she began, her voice calm but clear. "I know this process hasn't been easy, but easy doesn't fix what's broken." She paused, letting her words settle. "The Oversight Committee's findings are in. They've confirmed what some of us already knew and what others may have been avoiding. This precinct has a problem. Not just with Officer Carter, not just with one incident, but with a culture that's allowed problems like his to go unchecked." A murmur rippled through the room, but Olivia pressed on. "This isn't about pointing fingers or laying blame. It's about facing the truth and deciding what we do next. The choice is simple. Do we stay the same? Or do we become better?" An officer near the back raised a hand. It was O'Connor, one of Carter's staunchest allies. His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "And what if we don't agree with how you're trying to make us better? Some of us think this whole thing is more about politics than policing." The room stilled, all eyes shifting between Olivia and O'Connor. Olivia's expression didn't waver. She met his gaze directly, her tone measured but firm. "This isn't about politics, O'Connor. This is about professionalism. It's about serving this community with integrity. Not just enforcing the law but living up to the responsibility that comes with the badge." O'Connor crossed his arms, his defiance evident. "It's easy for you to say. You haven't been here as long as some of us. You don't know what it's like to walk these streets, to deal with what we deal with every day." Olivia took a step closer, her voice quiet but no less commanding. "You're right. I haven't been here as long as you. But I've been in places like this my entire career. I know what it's like to walk into a room and feel the weight of people's assumptions before I've said a word. I know what it's like to prove myself over and over again, just to be taken seriously. So don't tell me I don't understand." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Olivia let the moment stretch before continuing. "You think this is hard? Change is always hard, but so is losing the trust of the people we're supposed to protect. So we look the other way when we know we can do better. The question isn't whether this is hard. The question is whether we're willing to do the hard work." After the meeting, Olivia lingered in the squad room, speaking with officers who approached her, some cautiously, others with tentative support. O'Connor stayed back, watching her with a mix of skepticism and something else she couldn't quite place. Later that day, as Olivia reviewed the next steps for implementing the Oversight Committee's recommendations, Sergeant Davis knocked on her office door. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. That was something, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Olivia glanced up from her notes. Good or bad? Davis shrugged. Depends on who you ask. Some of the guys are coming around. Martinez said he thinks you're making sense. O'Connor, not so much. Olivia sighed, setting her pen down. O'Connor's not the problem. It's the officers who agree with him but won't say it out loud. They're the ones we have to reach. Davis nodded, his face thoughtful. You're walking a tightrope, Lieutenant, but I think you're holding steady. As the day drew to a close, Olivia found herself in the parking lot again, the twilight sky casting long shadows over the precinct. She leaned against her car, watching as officers came and went. Their movements like fragments of a larger picture, fractured, disjointed, but still part of the same whole. She thought about the fault lines running through the precinct, the cracks that had been there long before she arrived. She thought about the weight of the badge she wore and the responsibility it carried. Not just to enforce the law but to embody it. And she thought about the officers who still resisted, who saw change as a threat rather than an opportunity. She didn't resent them. She understood them, even if she didn't agree with them. Change was hard, but it was necessary, and sometimes it meant drawing a line in the sand. Olivia straightened, her resolve solidifying as the first stars appeared in the sky. The path ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't walking it alone. For every O'Connor, there was a Martinez. For every step backward, there was a step forward. And as long as there was progress, no matter how slow or uneven, Olivia would keep walking. The days following the Oversight Committee's findings were tense. Olivia could feel the atmosphere in the precinct shifting, though not always in the direction she'd hoped. Progress was a fragile thing, like a plant pushing through rocky soil, strong enough to grow, but vulnerable to being trampled. In the morning light, the precinct's halls were quieter than usual. Conversations happened in hushed tones, officers careful not to let their voices carry. Olivia noticed it as she walked to her office. The way some officers avoided her gaze while others gave her hesitant nods. The division within the precinct was no longer beneath the surface, it was laid bare for everyone to see. When she reached her desk, she found a neatly folded note waiting for her. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the blocky, uneven handwriting. We don't need you. Go back where you came from. She stared at the words for a long moment, her expression unreadable. This wasn't the first time she'd faced hostility, and she doubted it would be the last. Still, the note carried a weight, a reminder of just how much resistance she was up against. She folded the paper again and tucked it into her desk drawer. There was no point dwelling on it now. She had work to do. Later that morning, Olivia sat in a conference room with Captain Mitchell, Sergeant Davis, and a handful of officers tasked with implementing the precinct's new de-escalation protocols. The meeting was practical, focused, but the tension in the room was palpable. Olivia could sense the unease among some of the officers, their resistance simmering just beneath the surface. We're rolling out the first training sessions next week, Olivia said, her tone calm but firm. Attendance is mandatory for all personnel. This isn't negotiable. One of the senior officers, a man named Callahan, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. With all due respect, Lieutenant, some of us don't see how this is supposed to help. We already know how to handle ourselves out there. Olivia met his gaze evenly. This isn't about questioning your abilities, Callahan. It's about expanding them. De-escalation isn't just a skill, it's a responsibility. We owe it to the people we serve to use every tool at our disposal to keep situations from turning violent. Callahan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Olivia continued, her voice steady. I know some of you think this is unnecessary, maybe even insulting, but the truth is, we've seen what happens when we don't prioritize these skills. If we want to rebuild trust, within this precinct and with the community, this is where we start. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the group. Mitchell finally spoke, his tone measured. She's right. We can't afford to ignore this. If we don't adapt, we're not just failing ourselves, we're failing the people who depend on us. The meeting ended on a somber note, and as the officers filed out, Olivia noticed Callahan lingering by the door. He glanced at her, his expression conflicted. Before leaving without a word, she let out a quiet sigh. Change was never easy, but she had to believe it was worth the struggle. That afternoon, Olivia found herself in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sergeant Davis joined her, leaning against the counter with a thoughtful expression. "You handled Callahan well," he said after a moment. Olivia glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I'm not sure he'd agree with you." Davis shrugged. "Doesn't matter. What matters is that you're standing your ground. They might not like it, but they'll respect it eventually." "Eventually," Olivia repeated, her tone tinged with skepticism. "That's the tricky part, isn't it?" Davis nodded, his gaze distant. "Change is slow, and sometimes, it's messy, but it's necessary. You're doing the right thing, even if it doesn't always feel like it." As the day wore on, Olivia found herself reflecting on her journey so far. She thought about the officers who had stood by her, like Davis and Martinez, and those who had pushed back at every turn, like O'Connor and Callahan. She thought about the community outside the precinct walls, watching and waiting to see if things would truly improve. And she thought about the note in her desk drawer, its words a bitter reminder of how far they still had to go. When she finally left the precinct that evening, the sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink, the air heavy with the scent of rain. She paused by her car, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. Change, she thought, wasn't just about policies or training sessions. It was about people, their fears, their hopes, their capacity to grow. It was about confronting uncomfortable truths and choosing to move forward anyway. It was about persistence, even in the face of resistance. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Olivia got into her car and drove away, her resolve as steady as ever. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't walking it alone. And for now, that was enough. The precinct was quieter now, but not silent. The tension that had once permeated every corner had softened, replaced by an uneasy calm. Olivia sat at her desk, her office window overlooking the city streets. The morning sun cast long shadows on the pavement below, and she found herself watching as people hurried to their destinations, unaware of the battles fought behind closed doors. The changes had begun to take root. New training protocols were in place. Officers were attending de-escalation workshops, and the oversight committee had become a fixture in the precinct's daily operations. Yet, Olivia knew that change was not a straight line. There were moments of progress, yes, but also moments of doubt and resistance. She felt both in equal measure. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Captain Mitchell, his expression unreadable. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "They're ready for you," he said. Olivia nodded, rising from her chair. Today was the first official review of the reforms. A meeting with the Oversight Committee and senior officers to assess their progress. She had prepared for this. Yet a part of her couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the back of her mind. Would the changes they'd fought for be enough? Or would they be seen as too little? Too late? The conference room was filled with familiar faces. Dr. Eleanor Hayes sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Beside her were other members of the Oversight Committee, their presence a reminder that this was not just an internal matter. Around the table sat senior officers, including Callahan and O'Connor, their expressions a mix of apprehension and skepticism. Olivia took her seat, feeling the weight of their gazes on her. When the meeting began, Dr. Hayes spoke with her usual crisp authority. "We've reviewed the initial findings and observed the implementation of the new protocols," she said. "Today, we're here to discuss what's working, what isn't, and what steps need to be taken moving forward." The room was silent as Hayes continued, her words measured but firm. She outlined the progress they'd made. The increased accountability, the improved handling of civilian complaints, and the early success of the de-escalation training. But she didn't shy away from highlighting the challenges. There were still officers resistant to change, still moments when old habits threatened to resurface. When Hayes invited input from the room, Olivia was the first to speak. Her voice was calm, steady, though her words carried weight. "We've made progress," she began, her eyes meeting those of her colleagues. "But we have to acknowledge that this is just the beginning. These changes aren't about checking boxes or meeting quotas. They're about creating a culture where accountability is the norm, not the exception. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. That takes time. It takes commitment. And it takes all of us working together, even when it's uncomfortable. There was a moment of silence before Callahan spoke. His tone was cautious, but there was no mistaking the hint of respect in his voice. I'll admit, I wasn't on board with all this at first. But seeing the way things have been handled, the way you've handled it, I can see that it's making a difference. It's not easy, but maybe it's what we need. The admission hung in the air. A quiet victory in itself. Olivia nodded, grateful but not triumphant. There was still work to do. That evening, Olivia found herself walking through the precinct, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. She paused by the break room, where a group of younger officers was gathered, their laughter a soft hum in the background. They were discussing the latest training session, their conversation light but engaged. It was a small thing, but it gave her hope. As she continued her walk, she passed O'Connor, who was sitting at his desk, his focus on a stack of paperwork. He looked up briefly, their eyes meeting. He gave her a curt nod. Not friendly, but not hostile either. It was enough. The day ended much as it began, with Olivia at her desk, the city lights twinkling in the darkness outside. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The precinct wasn't perfect. It might never be, but it was better than it had been. And that was something. She opened the drawer where she had kept the anonymous note from weeks ago. She unfolded it one last time, the words stark against the white paper. Then, without hesitation, she tore it in half and tossed it into the trash. It was time to let it go. Change, she realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing despite it, and building something stronger in its wake. And as she sat there, the hum of the precinct around her, Olivia felt a quiet resolve. The work wasn't done, but neither was she, not by a long shot.